Good afternoon. I read an article Friday, and I wanted to connect with you all and have a kind of a quick discussion about it. I guess it's less of a discussion, more of a monologue. So I found it interesting timing wise. I found it interesting in terms of its content, and I wanted to share it with you as it falls well within the corruption domain, if you will. So in February, Russia invades Ukraine. And immediately the United States puts the weight of its financial weight, its political weight, its message weight. They started controlling the messaging pretty quickly, along with the elements within the media. Um, in times of war, controlling the message is called propaganda. In times of peace, it's called politics. In reality, it's just another form of manipulation. Now, I get it. I mean, propaganda is a tool, a weapon, a useful one in times of war. Um, what was interesting about this was, from the onset, anybody who had anything negative to say about the money we were sending over to Ukraine or about Ukraine in general were quickly labeled uh, uh, Russian assets or anti-American, right? Those were the two big labels put on folks who had anything negative or contrary to the propaganda machine. That included, interestingly enough, those of us who operate in an unrelated discipline. I mean, it's outside of politics, it's outside of foreign policy and everything else, right? I mean, this is just the balls and strikes related to a specific discipline. In particular, I'm referring to that of corruption. So, if anyone spoke about the corruption from a historical perspective, in Ukraine, it was they got the same labels rather as anybody else who is speaking from a political perspective or just uh, anti-Ukrainian perspective from the right, the left, whatever the case. Um, Despite all the denials, particularly as it relates to the corruption that persisted and persists within Ukraine, despite all those denials over the last 3 or 4 months, this article came out on Friday, which kind of blew me away. It took me back a second. And then I started reading it, and I started figuring it out a little bit more. Um, I'm not a believer in coincidences, I mean, especially when it comes to politics and law enforcement and all that stuff. I mean, they call it political science for a reason. There's a process, right? In step one is this, step two is this, step three is this. So maybe adding some context that might explain why this article came out about a week ago. The president of the European Commission spoke to Ukraine's parliament and basically said, "Hey, you guys have really got to start addressing more aggressively your corruption. You got to start putting some teeth behind it." That certainly makes it very difficult for elements within the United States to deny that Ukraine has a corruption problem. And then Friday, again, coincidentally, the same day that this, or maybe not coincidentally, the same day this article comes out, the United States announces another $820 million in aid going to Ukraine. Again, just, the same day this article comes out, we announce more aid to Ukraine. Well, that puts us, since February, I believe, below $6 billion. Um, the article itself is a Q&A with Maria Yovanovitch, former ambassador to Ukraine. Certainly an esteemed career. She is in a position to know. Um, and for the most part, the article covers the topic very well. Um, One consideration I think that you have to have, or something you have to think about before or when you're reading this article, is that she's also a career diplomat. Now, I read somewhere once a great explanation about the difference between a politician and a diplomat. A politician will talk for hours without thinking about what he's saying. A diplomat will think for hours and never say anything at all. And I think that's a very good example or explanation or juxtaposition of the two individuals, politicians and diplomats. But neither end up ultimately being reliable sources when it comes to matters related to law enforcement, when it comes to matters related to criminal behavior. The reason is the politician is going to deceive you, and the diplomat's going to soften the blow, right? Because that's what they do. And this article is not much of an exception to that. But like I said, overall it's pretty concise, pretty clear, pretty reasonable and thoughtful. There's one area that I specifically wanted to address. Let me read you the question. The U.S. is giving Ukraine huge amounts of aid. Does that make you nervous when it comes to corruption? And the response, in part and mostly, I'm not saying that magically everything changed on February 24th, because of course it didn't. But if the Ukrainians were sidelining some of the assistance, selling it to whomever for a profit, you can't just do that on your own. These are big systems. And I just think that in this existential moment, when Ukrainians are fighting for their country, their freedom, their families, I don't think it'd be tolerated. I think somebody would blow the whistle, and I think it would be stopped. So, existential moment. This is do or die. This is about the Ukrainian people. Somebody would blow the whistle, and somebody would stop it. And those three things kind of dovetail into the three reasons why I have an issue with that response. The first is corruption in times of war and disaster becomes exponentially worse. If you're already a severely corrupt country, chaos, wartime, disaster, corruption gets worse. It doesn't get better. The narcissist does not become an altruist in a heavily funded moment of chaos. He only gets worse because the opportunities have increased significantly. So, and this is not anomaly stuff. This is not my opinion. This is a broadly accepted principle within the corruption world. In my, the book that I recently released on corruption in the United States, I think it's chapter 8, disaster relief, corruption, and fraud. I have a whole chapter on this type of thing. This is not news. Corruption gets worse in times of war. Period. Reason number 2, I have a problem with that answer, and it's a two-parter. It's 2A and 2B. So we've, even in this article, we've got the ambassador of corruption, former ambassador of Ukraine, verifying the historical context of corruption in Ukraine. Right? It's well understood that the corruption historically has been a problem there. If the problem is so bad, then who would the whistleblowers report the theft and the corruption and the fraud to? Systemic corruption in a country, in a region, in an area, in a city block, wherever it exists, is the result of law enforcement either A, at least in part, is either A, shown an unwillingness to address the corruption, or B, an inability to address the corruption. So you can't go to law enforcement. They've already shown a historical inability to address it or unwillingness to address it. So who does the whistleblower go to? That's 2A. 2B, the whistleblower doesn't exist in a systemic corrupt community. And the reason is because they've already seen that their country, their region, their community, whatever the case, is unwilling to address corruption. People do not go and identify crimes to agencies, organizations, or individuals who they don't believe are going to do anything about it. They accept it. We're corrupt. This is what they do. They steal money. We just hope that some of it gets to us. That's the approach. So 2A and 2B are basically, this is a corrupt place. It is historically corrupt. The whistleblowers won't do that. They would have no reason to believe that the absence of integrity before war would somehow all of a sudden appear in times of war. It's okay for you to steal. Everyone's okay with the stealing and the pillaging and the corruption and the fraud before wartime. But when wartime comes, this is the line everybody's going to draw. I don't buy it. I don't buy it, and I don't think that there's necessarily historical context to support that. So that's 2A and 2B3. So then the next answer is, well, they'll report it to the United States. Well, that's 3. Reason number 3 I have a problem with this answer is we've already shown that we're not okay with bad press for Ukraine. We're not okay with it. We're not okay with anybody saying anything negative about Ukraine. It doesn't matter in what context. So, what people have to understand is whether we're talking about Katrina, or we're talking about COVID, or we're talking about foreign aid, all of the money that is sent in those instances is sent with the understanding that a portion of it is going to be lost, stolen, and misused. It's just the reality. They call this the cost of doing business, cost of goods sold, whatever you want to call it. They know money is going to be taken. So just assuming that somebody in Ukraine who is not disenfranchised enough to the corruption that has already previously existed there decides, I'm going to go tell the United States, I bet they care. The truth is they're not going to care because they expect it to happen. And they're not going to allow the bad press to influence the overall message that they're trying to send. Again, this is not a monologue on what foreign policy is right and wrong in this instance and support. The politics is the politics, the foreign policy is the foreign policy. I'm giving the objective, nonpartisan view on the topic of corruption. And the reality is the American government has already shown that they're not willing to allow bad press on Ukraine come about. Any indication of corruption will be accepted as cost of doing business. So there's not going to be any reporting, which means it doesn't get stopped. We also have obviously no prosecutorial authority over there. So being able to stop it, I don't even know what that means exactly. We hold the money back and say you have to set this up in place and that up in place. The truth is the oversight doesn't exist because they're in wartime, which is why the corruption gets so much worse. Is there's generally no oversight during wartime. You can chalk up corruption as, I made a mistake. The chaos of the fog of war. So those are my big 3 reasons I have an issue with that response, and I get it. That's the diplomat's response, and it's a reasonable one from a diplomat, and it's probably the right one. I mean, it is the right one from a diplomat. I'm giving you the corruption discipline response. In the end, if this war persists, we will give more money. I would assume. I can't imagine we're not going to. We're already this far into it. Some or much of that money will absolutely be stolen as a result of fraud and corruption. The amount, we will never know. We will absolutely never know how much money has been taken. Maybe one of the big takeaways, one of the reasons we should be concerned is the lack of oversight, the unwillingness to accept or allow bad press. In other words, we're not willing to say, hey, there's a corruption problem. We're giving money, and we know some of it's going to be taken. We're going to do everything we can to protect it within reason, without impacting their ability to do what they have to do to fight the war. We're not willing to have these discussions and say those things, which I think many people would probably appreciate. We'd rather say, we're looking at it, there's oversight, this and that. But there is an oversight, there's an unwillingness to allow bad press and have an honest discussion about what the challenges in the region and the area are, the problems in that region and that area. We're not willing to have that discussion. That in and of itself is going to empower the corrupt politicians in Ukraine. So if you go for massive period, if you're corrupt, you receive a lot of money and nobody's watching you, you start increasing the frequency of corruption, right? The reporting from the people of Ukraine becomes less and less because less and less action is taken. Ultimately, from a corruption perspective, Ukraine could come out of this war with Russia worse off than it went in. they could come out worse off than they went in. We're throwing so much money over there, and we're not the only ones doing it. There's no oversight. There's no accountability, and the absence of both of those things empowers corruption. It empowers the bad deals and those who are making the bad deals to the point where when it's over, uh, they're going to continue. So I hope that that doesn't happen. I hope that there are things going on that are outside of our visibility. My experience suggests that that might not be the case. The unfortunate intersection of politics and law enforcement, politics and criminal behavior, it's an ugly place, especially when you start going overseas. Because we're willing to put up with and engage in a lot that we suggest domestically we're not in support of. But we'll keep our eyes peeled on how things continue to develop in the region. We will continue to pray for Ukrainian people, and for the Russian people. Listen, there are people suffering on both sides of this. There is no doubt. There are innocent people on both sides. We just want it to end as quickly as possible.